Jami-Lee Ross.
I move that the question be
I'm
now
going
put.
to call Lewis Wall.
Mr. Chair, tēnā koe te mangai o te whare, ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to this committee stage debate of the New Zealand Flag Referendums Bill. I particularly want to focus on Clause 10, Part 2 and Clause 13, and I want to start by commending my colleague, the Honourable Trevor Mallard, who managed to get 43,000 people to sign a petition to say that they wanted a yes-no vote, which is interesting because the flag consideration process only got 700 people along to the public consultations, which represents 1.6% of the people that engaged in the Honourable Trevor Mallard's process. And so I think that he's done a great service to democracy because he's got New Zealanders to engage in this process. So in terms of Clause 10, Mr. Chair, I want to congratulate my colleague Jacinda Ardern because I 100% support her supplementary order paper that wants to insert Clause 10, Subclause 2, which reads, the second flag referendum may take place only if more than 50% of electors return a valid voting paper to the returning officer in the first flag referendum. Why do I think that a simple majority actually is sufficient? Because a simple majority represents that the majority of voters or electors in our democracy actually agree with the proposition that, in fact, our flag should change. Why do I think that's incredibly important? Because I fundamentally believe in democracy, Mr. Chair, and a democratic principle actually is about majority rules. And so what this supplementary order paper ensures is that the voice of the majority of New Zealanders is actually more than taken into consideration, but actually guarantees the passage of this piece of legislation. And in fact, if we were to do that, we wouldn't be the only country in the world, in fact, Mr. Chair, to do that. Because in places like Armenia, they actually require a 50% of registered voters' support for any constitutional change. In the Cayman Islands, same process, more than 50% of registered voters have to vote for any constitutional change. In Hungary, they're a little bit different because they say half of the people who are registered to vote have to vote, and then half of those who have voted have to vote in favour of whatever the particular constitutional question is at hand. And so Ireland, for example, theirs isn't quite a majority, but they require 33% of voters who are registered to vote in favour of a particular proposition. In Sri Lanka, you have to have a turnout of more than 66.7%, and of those, a third of all possible voters have to support any constitutional amendments. In Zambia, 50% turnout requirement, and of those, 50% have to approve of any constitutional change. In Fiji, one of our Pacific cousins, they require a 75% approval. So essentially, Mr. Speaker, what I'm trying to do is to highlight that what my colleague Jacinda Ardern is doing is actually ingraining the principle of majority rules, which is a fundamental principle of democracy in this piece of legislation for any constitutional change to happen. I also want to speak to Clause 13, which is about alternative flag designs. And it's been really interesting reading some of the media commentary about the participation in this flag referendum bill. We've had over 10,293 flags submitted to the process that now the flag consideration panel is trying to ascertain 4 flags that will go into this referendum. But the interesting thing I want to highlight is of those, 25% are actually from people living overseas. So they're not New Zealanders. They've got no vested interest in our country. They actually don't live here. And so you kind of have to question what is the legitimacy of their entry in this process. Because 25% of people living overseas actually, to me, just reeks of them participating in an art competition. that New Zealand basically has had this big art competition and people overseas now think that actually they can decide what the identity of our country is. Now, is that valid? And actually, are all those flags going to be considered by this flag consideration panel? Because I would have thought that they shouldn't. Because if people have just put in a design, and actually it isn't about, Mr Chair,
Stuart Nash.